Hey everyone, Dave Greco here and welcome back to the channel. So for today's commentary and time-lapse, we had the awesome project of working on the Middara board game and working on an illustration for that project, creating one of their characters in an environment that they gave me. And so we can kind of talk about that process, some of the problem solving we did throughout it. And yeah, super excited to share that with everybody today. Another reminder, this video is sponsored by WACOM, an amazing brand of art tablets for everyone. I think everyone should at least check out. Is a brand that I have used exclusively for the past 17 years on all my paintings and everything that you see here on the channel. So I'll have a ton of links down below for a bunch of different ones for you to check out. There's some great entry point tablets. So let's pop on over to the commentary. All right, let's get started. Thank you so much for hopping over to the video and hanging out with me while we check out this entire process. So I actually wanted to leave this beginning part in for everybody. This is a sketch for the piece the first time it kind of popped into my head. And I wanted to get some ideas down. It ended up not working. I spent a little bit of time trying to figure out. But one thing that's always great is if something's not working for you or it doesn't feel right, it's totally fine to scrap it and start over. And I'm really glad I did on this one. So I wanted to leave this first version in. I had this idea of her coming forward and as she's coming out through this cave. The client had sent over some thumbnails of what it should look like, but the pose just seemed too straightforward to me. I wanted like a little bit more angle to her shoulders and her chest and how she was looking. And so this is part of the first version. And I think we took some ideas that we learned from this one as we applied it to the second. Now really kind of going over, I was really just throwing some lines down. I really want to get a pose figured out. And that seemed pretty important. Like she's still holding this crystal lantern in one hand, walking forward with her weapon, and then her cat on her shoulder. Yeah, there's just something, it always feels like when I'm starting a piece, there has to be something that catches me. Either it's some shapes in the face, or the angles of the eyes, or the way a piece of light is hitting the character. Like that always feels like really important. I have to really kind of attach myself onto something it's almost like I gotta fall in love with like at least a small little part of it, and there was just something kind of not doing it for me right here. So I kind of put it aside. This is where we see, and I was like, let me get like more of just a slightly downward angle on her face and see what we can sketch out. And I think it was just enough where we still had the same idea for the piece, but it was just enough for me to kind of refigure out and really kind of attach myself to some small parts of the painting. You know, I thought just the slight angle on her face was a little bit more interesting, looking down with the ears coming up, and then we can get like a little bit of a cooler angle of the gas mask itself as well. And so at this point I really didn't need to have the other image up anymore, but it just seemed already, even without figuring out the rest of the composition, that it was going to work a little bit better for me, and it was a good place to start. So like if anyone hasn't seen kind of a lot of the process for a lot of my work, sometimes I do kind of just dive right into the illustration. We don't spend a ton of time doing thumbnails. I always encourage people to thumbnail stuff out, especially if you're sending it over to a client. I actually worked out this big black and white, and then I sent it over for approval if we can take this over to rendering for the next stage, and then I usually send that back over to the client for them to check out as well. And so what was interesting about this piece and this project is they have a very kind of like anime style to their visuals, and that was a really cool thing for me. Is I wanted to bring kind of like how I render and think about work with like a little bit more kind of anime tweak, maybe how I push the eyes a little bit, or some of the rendering or the proportions. You know, I wanted kind of a more exaggerated anime pose. You know, I mean, she might have some spinal issues with that walk after, but it might look cool on the piece. And so then I'm really just going back and trying to tie in everything, specifically all these little assets, and little pieces of clothing that she's wearing. A lot of these things we can dive into these details later and really clean up, like how the things are shaped. Like I'm going to fix her legs later. Like it's a little crazy how one of her thighs is kind of coming up, but I can't focus on it right now. Let's just get diving into it. And then this is the part of the process that I always love to do the most, is love this little line detail. And this actually helps me figure out quite a bit. You know, a lot of people always ask me, like, why do I spend so much time doing all this line work? You end up painting over most of it. And I think there's some truth to it that, you know, it probably does kind of waste a lot of time, but for me mentally, it helps me figure out a lot. It helps me figure out a lot of that kind of shape design and style that I'm going for. And at the same time, I'm figuring out a lot of these little details. I'm not sure how all this gas mask is going to be working. And it helps me a lot to just figure out like all these, you know, if it has like these little crystal shaped parts coming out of the top, how is her actually headband, you know, working with the lamp on it. And so I think I just think through that process a lot more with line, where some artists really go in with a lot of like their blocking in shape and form, where I actually, you know, I think there's still part of that, I don't know, growing up with comic books and falling in love with all that stuff, that helps me a lot. And so it's easy to kind of come over and just figure out that process like this. You know, I think it looks good too. I like messing with that line weight and just seeing it come to life that way, you know. But yeah, so it's a lot of like, you know, flipping the canvas back and forth. You know, you're going to see a lot of the same process from a lot of these commentary videos, kind of what we're doing. But I think I'm starting to refine it a little bit. I'm trying to spend a little bit less time in the black and white. We still spent at least a couple hours. I think this piece in total took about 11 hours total. All said and done, when I crunched down this time lapse into about 20 minutes, I think it was 11 hours beforehand. Yeah, so it's just really going back and forth and trying to figure out all the little line stuff. You know, we go back and later even tweak out a lot more details on kind of, you know, how the cat's shape is, how the gas mask is formed, everything. It's got that little bell underneath for the collar. But once I can get like enough line drawing, that's when we can really start going in and get some values down. Now it's cool to get these little line drawings because she's got like a lot of these little belts and loops and these kind of like pads on her armor, which was really fun. I always like the design of the dagger. I like some type of blade that has a lot of crazy curves to it, and you can add a lot of style that way, which is always great. And so the drawing initially had this, it looked like a big scarf coming off, and I was having that kind of blow behind her. We ended up taking that off later. It seemed like it kind of fought what was happening. She's kind of in this cave area. I'm not sure this crazy gust force wind is going to be blowing the scarf around her. And also, she's got these like really large kind of angel wings on the character. That was something I had to really figure out as we went. A big part of the piece was showing off the environment. That was kind of a purpose, the character and environment. So the environment was very important. But she has these like massive wings behind her that's going to cover up a ton. And so like with any illustration, there's just a lot of problem solving you need to figure out. So like we have to show these wings, but we also have to show this kind of mine that she's walking through. And how do we do that? And how do we have some good value so it reads pretty well off the bat too? You know, can I lighten the wings up enough behind her so she pops? And then how do we get the mine to, you know, look like it's properly pushed back in space behind her, but also reads? And so I kind of just block in a base value of her entire body. I just put it on a different layer and kind of just block the whole thing out. You know, we're not worried about too much about lighting. We get some kind of general, you know, 2/3 lighting kind of coming down from the top right, just to kind of give some type of visual interest. You know, I think you could really go crazy and figure out a bunch of different lighting scenarios for this piece. Like you could have a lot of the piece be pretty dark with your primary light coming from this like crystal lamp she's holding, and then you have like a secondary cool light hitting from the opposite side of her. It would have been pretty interesting. I think we could have went a bunch of different directions, and I think they're all totally awesome directions to go in. Yeah, so even looking at this initial one, how much like, you know, that front leg is pushed up so high, so I'm glad we changed that later. I think we played with the idea right here of the light kind of hitting a ton from the lamp, but I don't think you have to go crazy with all these kind of little light sources and lighting up little parts of the body. Like you just it can get confusing, and you always have to think about what is the important part for you to read and to look at on a piece. And I think you can get distracted sometimes by trying to make all these little accurate light sources, and if it's not the point of the piece, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. So it's basically all the time we spent in the black and white. So for this, really start jamming on a multiply layer. And this is part of the process. I'm definitely going to be looking to try to modify and change up as we progress with our work in the future. This is kind of what I call like the mud phase of painting over a black and white. I'm always do like where the kind of colors end up later, but it's a process, and you're cleaning up a lot of that kind of mud, and it's kind of just like these dirty gray colors. But for me, part of the process kind of works too, because I like to build up my saturation slowly, and if I can find some areas to kind of bring that color out, that kind of adds to the piece. And by starting so desaturated and gray, it kind of helps me figure it out, because I figure out so much as we work, and I can figure a lot of ideas that maybe she's a lot warmer in color with some warm light on her, and the background is very cool. Is that a different way where we could have the piece just even read that much better? And so that was something that was intentional. And then we can really start to bring in more of those warmth. She's got this red hair, and if we can bring out some of those red and pinks in her skin tone and the hair in her ears and her arm, we can really make the center of this piece pop and really get this character out. So that's something I'm kind of thinking on as we go. And then the other areas there have a bit more of like a coolish light, so you can see the color of the skin above the eyebrow actually gets a little bit more blue. So that has a little nice kind of from the cool light into the warm right on the bottom of her face to kind of draw your eye in. And so you also notice as we go on further, as we send a version over to the client, and this is the type of feedback you might get as well, is that sometimes they're small things. They're like, we would like the character to be looking forward down the tunnel instead of looking at the camera. And so those are always things you just have to roll with. And I thought that was totally a solid change. So we do change her eye direction at one point, which basically at one point I just kind of erase out everything on there and just change where the pupils are looking. There's a couple small recording gaps, I think, during the rendering process, but it's really kind of the same stuff over and over. It kind of happens later. But see how we're slowly building up that saturation? Even if it's either like an overlay layer, or I'll just straight paint the color right on top. Like this is just a normal layer, and I know what the kind of local color of it should be, which is like, what is that color if there was no lighting, anything, and I stay pretty muted with it, because I know we're going to build up the highlights, we're going to build up some of that light on top of it, and that's really where we want it to be. If you hear any purring in the background, Marlo has joined us once again and is purring pretty close to the mic. Yeah, so a lot of this, we're pulling up the lights, we're pushing back those darks a little bit further. I'm still going back in and doing a little bit of the line work to get it figured out. And it's kind of like this weird rendering tug of war of dark to light. It really is. It's just kind of this process for me over and over. We're changing a lot of the shapes, like, her part of her arm looked a little bit too long, kind of around the biceps. Let's push, bring the arm back up. And then I'll stay pretty zoomed out, and let's just keep cleaning up. Let's slowly go down, get a little more kind of highlights on the chest and some of the belt loops. And how do we bring that down into the rest of the shirt? Even with that like slight rendering on the shirt, I know that like I'm going to build up more of that saturated red at one point towards the center of her body to bring even more kind of visual interest in, right? That's super important. So I just want to get, it's like you're just kind of playing cleanup around this whole thing. Now let me just push back some of the crazy sketchiness around the outside of the body. So so it just reads a little bit better, and kind of figure out where these other colors are going to go. And then we can make a bunch of comparisons on what's working, what's not working, and do we need to tweak it? Do we need to push it further? Are like some areas too soft? And for me, it's like, these are all the big questions. Like I can show you lots of tutorials on these very specific things. Like this is how you draw an eye, or this is how I draw an eye. You want to put, the tear duct here. That stuff to me isn't as impactful for long-term growth of so many of you trying to learn. It's more of just like how, when do you ask yourself these questions about a piece, and what can you do about just thinking about them, and how do you react to trying to fix them or work on them? Because we're all going to work very differently. But I think most of my growth always comes from, can I identify something that doesn't look right, and can I figure out a solution to fix it that works right within the piece where my current skill level is at? I think that's the best we can do. And so it's constantly just going around a piece and trying to identify what's not working, what is working. Do we know how to fix it? Can we fix it? And it's a lot of that back and forth. And so even at one point, I think part of the feedback was just get it a little bit smaller in the piece. We just need to see a little bit more of the background in the mine shaft. And so a lot of things I'm thinking about now is like, there's not a lot of contrast in the piece. I want to make sure she is reading well off those wings. Is the value of those wings, would they be kind of so light around the center part of her body behind her? Probably not. Is it going to work better for the piece, and does it look believable in the piece to pull that off? I thought so. And I thought it was kind of like a nice little addition to it. So I think we kind of made it work. We actually kind of went through and wanted to kind of redesign different aspects of the cat's head, make sure the shapes worked okay, all that. And so and that's the process. You can really just go over a piece over and over and over. I wish I had the focus to really spend a ton of time on a piece and polish and polish and polish and polish. But sometimes you always just have to move on to the next. If it's working well and it's solid, sometimes you don't need to go super, super crazy. But yeah, you could even see that a lot of the background still kind of just blocked in. We started to get some polish in, but I didn't feel like we needed to go too crazy with the entire shape of it. And so the same thing, we're just popping in like another overlay layer and just getting a little bit more saturation going. And then just trying to get these small little details. For me at this point is I'm just trying to get through the piece and make sure there's no areas that look really comparatively undefined compared to the rest. Like you can see the top right of those crystals are really not rendered even at all. Let's try to bring that in so at least the piece looks completely finished and fleshed out. Yeah, so that's really, it's just going over and over. I want to make sure the legs are reading. This looks like the new kind of polished legs we put on. And we could have really dived in. You could put more details and all the little stuff on the bottom of the body. Is it important? Is it going to make the piece better? I'm not sure. That's actually a big thing I learned for a long time while working in the game industry, is the idea of if you add more polish, if you change this, does it necessarily make the piece better, right? It might make it different, but if you put that time in, does it actually make it better? And you deal with that with a lot of feedback from like art directors or creative director. And they want to make a change to a piece. Like, are they just changing a piece to just change it? Is it actually making the piece or design better? Or are they just making it different? And sometimes you have to kind of identify that, and maybe it's not worth the time. If it's not actually better, then why, if it's fine the way it is, then why spend the time? So that's something that does sit with me through a lot of things. So, and I think one thing that's good you could do also during a piece is pull up the curves. Your levels or your curves, you have more control over your values with curves. So get used to getting in there in Photoshop and pull those open and kind of, see what you can do with the piece, punch that contrast just a little bit more. It's always a great thing to do towards the end of the piece. One thing that I remember being told in art school, and it's always stuck with me, and I think we were doing some type of digital art class, and he told us, he's like, do the levels on your piece at the end of every piece. Trust me, your piece will be just a couple % better every time if you just tweak those levels just a tiny bit to make them pop. And that's something that's always sat with me, and I think it's absolutely true. Well, thank you all so much for watching the process of this piece. Here is the final. Thank you very much. I put this up on my Instagram this morning, so if you want, I have that in the description below. You can always check out my Instagram to see all the pieces that we do recently. And thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one.